All right, well, today we're going to talk about access to Foothills Park, Palo Alto's residents-only park. And joining us is Ryan McCauley, Palo Alto Parks and Recreation Commissioner. You've been very involved in crafting a pilot program to allow non-residents access to the 1,400-acre preserve. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good morning.
It's been many, many years that people have talked about how come Palo Alto's Foothills Park is residents only. The idea of opening it up for greater access has come and gone and come and gone. So I'm kind of curious, like, what was the tipping point? Why are we actually crafting a pilot program now?
You know, as you mentioned, it's definitely been a topic that's been batted around over many years. I moved to Palo Alto in 2009. And when I first moved here, I definitely found it to kind of be an odd policy, kind of a little bit of a head-scratching thing, because it's uncommon, right?
Yeah.
There's nowhere else that I'm aware of that has a gated park like Foothills Park is. But what really sort of precipitated it for me was I started volunteering with a group that does after-school mentoring for students in East Palo Alto. Great program. I got to know a lot of the kids, and it dawned on me just through conversation that so many of these kids didn't have very good opportunities to learn about their environment. And definitely they're working hard, they're trying to get that sort of education, but it's not in place. And I was amazed. I've definitely heard this on KQED before, not specifically about East Palo Alto, but about other communities in the Bay Area where students have never been to the Pacific Ocean. And I found that to be the case with the students that I was working with. So I joined the Parks and Recreation Commission around the same time. And that confluence of experiences for me personally is one of the things that caused me to say, maybe we should seriously study how we can, at the very least, welcome the people we most want to reach out to, which, from my perspective, is the next generation of people who we want to become environmental stewards. So that was the connection and the driving force or the catalyst for me in the first instance. And I think that it's probably a pretty similar reason for most of the commission members.
Yeah, there's such a benefit to being out in nature, in the environment. And
Absolutely.
It's so close.
Yeah, and Foothills Park is really a special place. I know that all the commission members are of the view that it's a very special place. My own view, and I think that the majority of the commission members, is that we can responsibly share it. And so we want to definitely maintain and retain the special character of the place. But if there's a way that we can give that experience to other people in a responsible way, we should probably find out how to do it. And so then once we started to kind of conceptually think, is there a better policy than what we're doing now? We worked through the process. There was a committee, an ad hoc committee, that's been working on this for over a year. And we went through lots of different ideas and alternatives, lots of public meetings on the topic, 3 of them in the past 6 months. And through that whole process, which was, I think, a really helpful one, we landed on the current pilot.
So was this an idea that came from the commission, or did this go through the council first and then went to the commission? And...
That depends on what year we're talking about. We're coming back and forth. The council has certainly batted it around years ago and came very close to change it, but didn't. But I think the most recent initiative came from you guys, right? I mean, I know it came up in a joint study session with the city council, and at that time, I believe it was Ryan and 2 of his colleagues who were sitting on an ad hoc committee on the Parks Commission who really kind of took the lead on this, unless I'm mistaken.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask, like, one criticism. I think few could dispute the idea that, having access to nature is good for health and we want more kids exposed. But many people who have concerns about this pilot project, one of the first things they say is Palo Alto has dozens of parks. All of them are open except this one for specific reasons. Some would say preservations, others point to the financial arrangement that, kind
history.
of was in effect since the 60s. So what would you say to those people who say, kids can go any other park and there's plenty of them? Why Foothills?
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that we have other opportunities for people to be outdoors. Certainly the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District provides opportunities up and down the peninsula. And there's also Pearson or Rastradero, which borders Foothills Park, or at least for part of the parks, they border one another. But I think that everybody appreciates and recognizes that Foothills Park has something that those other parks doesn't. other parks don't, I should say. And so...
Besides a resident-only requirement.
Well, so the variety of different ecosystems within Foothills Park definitely distinguishes it, for example, from Pearson and Rastradero. And the fact that we have Baranda Lake within Foothills Park and the opportunities that that provides. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of reasons why Foothills Park is special. But I don't think anyone's probably going to dispute that Foothills Park is a little bit more special than some of the other parks in the area. So then the question is, again, is there a way that we can reasonably, responsibly share that? Or do we have to, say, definitely no one other than residents is able to visit the park? And the other thing about this is that, to the extent that we're concerned about ecological preservation, and I think that we all are, it doesn't really matter whether it's a Palo Alton who might be walking through the park, or a person from Menlo Park, or a person from Mountain View, or a person from Redwood City. So, the need for it to be only Palo Alto residents as opposed to a broader community of people who want to be in nature and are being thoughtful about the environmental protection of the area, that's what we care about. And then with respect to the amount of money that Palo Alto invested at the outset, a couple of notes. One of which is that this was a quasi-donation. So the city of Palo Alto paid for the property that is comprising the park today, but it was a pretty good price. It was a really good price, actually. So that investment, which I think was about $1.1 million or something like that, perhaps you remember the history.
Don't remember, but I have your staff report.
Yeah, so it's probably in there. It was
Russell Lee was generous.
It was a very good deal for the city of Palo Alto. Had we had the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District at the time, I would imagine that it would be part of that system instead of being a Palo Alto City Park, but that system didn't exist at the time. So, certainly I wish that the communities that Palo Alto reached out to at that point in time would have contributed to the cost to purchase the land. But I think that Palo Alto has received a really good return on its investment over these many years. And so from my perspective, and again, I think it's the view of most of the commissioners, that initial investment of $1 million or $1.1 million is not a big factor driving the thought process for why today we should have the current policy.
So let's talk a little bit about the proposed pilot. What are the factors there that address how many people could come in? How do they pay? Do they not pay? What's the time limit for the pilot? Can you walk us through?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's being proposed is a 1-year pilot period. The reason that we went with 1 year is because we think it makes a lot of sense, given all the historical data that the city has accumulated about the visitation of the park, to do this over a period that would match up, right? So if for some reason we saw with the pilot higher visitation in January than we have historically, it would be something for us to try and understand, right? Similarly, if we had higher visitation in the summer months, does there need to be some sort of adjustment? One of the things I love about the pilot program is that it's flexible from my perspective. So it gives staff the ability, within some guardrails, within some parameters, to adjust the number of passes that they would have available on any given day based on this trove of historic data we have. So there is 60 plus years of visitation information for Foothills Park. I'd probably say the most pertinent is the last 20 years. And that data is daily. So we know how many people visited on November 15th, I think today is, in 2005, for example, right? And we know that, year over year. And we can see trends. So Veterans Day, which was this past week, tends to be a more popular day in the park. We know that June, July, August tend to be the more popular months in the park. We know that just anecdotally, but it's borne out in all the data. And so the pilot program allows city staff to say, okay, in January or February, when we have historically low visitation, we might have more passes available to non-residents. In May, June, July, we might have fewer, and we will have fewer. And that's the design of the program.
Okay.
And so they can really dial it in based on all the information that we have.
And I was quite struck by the historical information from the late 60s, early 70s, showing that attendance was more than twice what it has been in the last 2 decades that you mentioned. It was like in the high 300,000s way back then. I was wondering if you have any insights as to why that is and whether there were any kind of impacts either to nature or to, funding for the extra visitors back then? Because I feel like if there weren't, that would give the pilot a lot more it would be easier to kind of get rid of some of the barriers restricting this pilot.
Yeah, so certainly I don't have firsthand experience from the 1960s and 70s.
You've done a lot of research,
but we have dug in and done the research, and it's impressive that the park sustained, much more visitation than it does today. Like you said, it's 2 or 3x.
372,000 visitors.
Wow.
That was the peak.
So there were 1,000 a day or plus. More than that.
That's right. Yeah, and interestingly, there's a cap on the number of visitors that can be in the park at any one time. It's 1,000 people. And not to say that it's directly correlated, but it actually kind of bears out to that historic level of visitation, which was 370 plus for several years there in the 1970s. And yeah, so it's interesting. There have been peaks and valleys in the visitation to the park. Definitely when the park first opened, that first decade when the park opened, saw the most visitation by far. It dropped off into the 1980s. I think there were probably a couple of reasons for the drop-off. There was, at one point in time, a fee that was imposed through the 1990s in order to help recover some costs related to Boronda Lake. I think it was a $3 fee for entry at that time. So that could have potentially driven down a little bit of visitation, but there's also just cultural trends and things that were happening within Silicon Valley that might have, changed people's recreation behavior. So then into the 2000s and the last decade, there's been an uptick. So we're back at a pretty steady level. It's been, with one exception, it's been very steady in the past 20 years, right around 150,000 people visiting the park per year.
And we haven't heard any anecdotes from rangers who were around in the 70s talking about kind of deterioration of the environment because of those busy years. I imagine it also might have something to do with the fact that it was pretty new back then and they were building all this stuff. But
yeah, that's right.
Like you, I wasn't there, so.
And I think probably one other factor would be that there were not as many parks like Foothills Park as there may be today, right? So again, Mid-Peninsula didn't exist. Certainly there was an ethos about trying to preserve open spaces for the public, but it hadn't yet been realized in many respects in the 1960s and 70s. So Foothills Park was, in lots of respects, probably the first one in the area to offer those sorts of opportunities.
And I was struck that this pilot program that you guys proposed, it has multiple components. One of them has to do with the kind of broad opening up of access to a limited number of non-residents, but there's another kind of aspect to it which has to do with field trips and schools, which kind of goes back to what you said at the very beginning about your mission for proposing this. Can you talk a little about the new policy or the proposed policy for field trips that you guys would like to see implemented?
Yeah, so as part of the pilot, and this is the one of the things that's amazing to me about the current way that the city code is stated. So field trips for anyone outside of Palo Alto, if you're not a Palo Alto resident, if you had a group of 3rd or 4th graders coming from Redwood City or coming from San Jose or somewhere else, they wouldn't be allowed to visit the park. And I think that's just for a bunch of reasons, a horrible policy. So one of the things we want to definitely encourage is the opportunity for kids to be in nature and have a sort of facilitated experience where they learn about the park and learn about nature. So we've had lots of discussions with the Junior Museum and Zoo and also with the ranger staff at the park about how to facilitate that in the right way. And that's a key part of the pilot program would be, making clear that those participants are allowed to visit the park with field trips and whatnot, and then hopefully return to the park with their families and pick up some of these non-resident passes for a particular day.
So this program would be kind of separate from the 50 permits that would be distributed to non-residents.
That's right.
Like the school kids from Menlo Park or East Palo Alto wouldn't have to buy permits. They would just be able to sign up for field trips and they would be allowed in. Is that the idea?
That's right. So one of the other things that is great about the pilot, and it's a big reason, let me back up for a moment, a big reason that I find the pilot to be really attractive is that we have both this trove of data. We know when the park is busy and when it's not. And as a general matter, I think we've probably all been to the park on a weekday and you can say, wow, I only saw 2 other people in the park, on this particular day. And you can...
I haven't, I don't live here.
Okay, fair enough. But you know that it's underutilized oftentimes during weekdays. And then oftentimes on non-peak weekends, it's underutilized as well. So we know that there's some excess capacity there. But for our students, also for volunteer groups that we want to partner with, and we have partnered with over many years, so environmental volunteers, Canopy, Grassroots Ecology, there's other volunteer groups that are strategic partners with the city, that we would allow them access to these passes and actually perhaps set aside a certain number of passes so that we make sure we reach those volunteers, we reach those students. And so a reason that the pilot at this point in time, from my perspective, is a really good idea is because we have the technological capability to do that. The city's bringing online a new reservation system. It's called Civic Rec, and it'll be used for all of the recreation program reservations that folks make in Palo Alto. And it has a lot of functionality that the prior system did not have. So the ability technologically to do this in a pretty seamless way is another great reason why this is a good moment for us.
Yeah. So should people with passes have to pay to get into the park? I mean, that you could go either way. You could say we want to give access to lower income folks, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay, but then there's the costs for the staffing and all that. So where did the ad hoc committee land?
Yeah, so the pilot proposal approved by the commission is that there would be a $6 fee generally for non-residents with proposed fee waivers for students, for volunteers, and those who might be low-income individuals. And again, one of the beauties of the city's new online reservation portal is that once the city flags someone as having qualified for a low-income scholarship or waiver for any program, then they can apply that flag for the Foothills Park reservation system too.
Okay. Do people have to prove that they are low income? Do they have to submit anything, or do they just check a box?
Yeah, my understanding is that there is a process through which they, document for the city that they qualify.
Yeah. So I'm always fascinated by ideas that kind of come up but then don't make it into the program. So I was reading through the report and I noticed there were a couple of different ideas, such as like running shuttles from the libraries or the community center up to Foothills Park. There was a visitor training program, like people would have to go through some sort of orientation. Can you talk about some of the ideas that were also kicked around and why they're set to the side for now?
Yeah, and those were a couple of the big ones. There was also an idea that we would extend access to any student in PAUSD plus any student in the Ravenswood School District, along with their families. They would essentially have the same privileges as a City of Palo Alto resident. The thought behind that one was, again, we're trying to reach students in particular. At the end of the day, operational factors and considerations definitely drove us towards the current pilot. And so, the current pilot is probably not perfect, but hopefully it reaches a lot of the goals that we're after. So on the student side, being able to potentially set aside a particular block of these passes for students, and also if we make them available without cost for students, then that probably obtains our objective, while also reaching the community more broadly. So you mentioned a couple of the other alternatives that we considered. So shuttles, there was a bill or a referendum statewide that was passed a couple of years ago that actually requires the state of California and calls upon communities within the state of California to expand access to recreational opportunities, environmental experiences and whatnot. And so that kind of dovetails with that idea. It could be a great concept. Operationally, it's going to be much more complicated. There could be some costs involved. But if we were able to partner with Stanford, who already has a great transportation system in the form of Marguerite, that could definitely be a good relationship to tender and build on that front. So
it's also worth noting that Palo Alto has been trying to expand its own city shuttle system for like a decade, and it takes forever, and it would undoubtedly delay the pilot program significantly if the shuttle thing was introduced. I'm not sure if that was part of the consideration, but I feel like that would be kind of an inevitable consequence. But I also wanted to kind of ask about the political aspect of this, because you guys voted this week to advance this by a 6-1 vote with Jeff Greenfield dissenting. And so from now, this will go to the council at some point. And the council, unlike the Parks and Rec Commission, is a very political body by definition. And they will be hearing from many residents, from many voters who oppose this for some of the reasons we mentioned before. They like the idea of, protecting the environment from more visitors or for whatever other reasons. So I just wanted to ask, throughout the process of crafting this pilot program, what kind of outreach have you guys done, and how have you guys considered like the critics who have emerged already and who are expected to kind of return once this gets to the next level?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it was really important that we had a very public process. The committee did lots of outreach, spoke with lots of people, but then we also had 3 public meetings on the topic. The first of those public meetings was one that was pretty open-ended. We laid out a menu of options, the alternatives that we had given thought to and considered. And we had folks at that first meeting. It was pretty evenly balanced. I think there were a couple more people who were in support of the pilot or some sort of program to open the park than who were opposed generally. But it was interesting at that first meeting when it was just generally, should we do something with the policy or not, there were definitely folks who came out and said, don't do anything. We took what they said, what their actual comments were into account, and tried to balance them and think about how do we refine this such that it could be a consensus sort of pilot program, right? Something that reflects those people's views as well as the people who want to see more equal access to Foothills Park. And so we came back in September with that proposal, which is largely what the commission passed this past week in November. And at that meeting, there was really just one person who commented sort of in a dissenting way, and that person was commenting that Foothills Park should have access for individuals only when they've been through some sort of orientation to the park, essentially, which is actually an alternative that we considered and decided for a number of different reasons, operational ones being significant ones, that wasn't probably the right way to go. So when we moved to this specific pilot proposal, that again, I hope folks feel they had opportunity to get a lot of feedback into, we didn't hear any real dissent. And then this past Tuesday at the meeting where it was heard again and advanced by the commission onto the city council, the same individual who spoke in September about folks should only be allowed into the park after they've gone through an orientation program reiterated that concern, but all the other speakers, and there were 6 or 7 other speakers, all voiced support, again, for the pilot program. So I don't mean to suggest that folks' views might have been completely addressed, but I hope that through that process, folks have seen that it's been, a thoughtful one, and that this is not going to lead to a change in the character of Foothills Park. That this is a pretty targeted, very controlled pilot that we've been trying to take into account the views of many different people and build the best consensus product.
So let's talk a little bit about how you know whether or not this pilot is successful. How are you evaluating it, measuring it? What are the parameters that make it something that could be permanent?
Yeah, so to come back to the new reservation system, Civic Rec, that the city has, it will allow us to obtain a lot of feedback from users who are using the pilot program. So that's one point of feedback that will be really helpful to us. The raw numbers will definitely be helpful to us. There's a number of more qualitative factors. For example, do we see more wear and tear in the park in some respect? It's even down to the detail of, do we have to replenish restroom supplies more often than we did previously, which is probably tied directly to the numbers, sure. But it's a more qualitative sort of thing. Are there what the rangers called social trails, people cutting off trails and things like that, making shortcuts in the park more frequently than there were previously? So anyway, there's a whole bunch of quasi-quantitative factors that we can kind of take into account. And then there's a bunch of qualitative factors, which is just how people feel about the experience and how they rate the experience. So the goal is to be as broad as possible, to cast a wide net. And, in terms of judging success, part of it will be the individual feedback, part of it will be the numbers, and definitely part of it, from my perspective, will be with the student volunteer programs, are we bringing the people that we most want to target up to the park? Yeah,
and we should say too that none of the rules of the park are changing. It's not like
that's right.
You can suddenly create your own trails and whatnot.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Bring
and my view is
thousands
that
of friends.
that folks from Menlo Park are no more likely to, create a trail that's not authorized than someone from Palo Alto, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. I think that pretty much summarizes this issue at this point. Was there anything else that we hadn't covered that we want to wrap up with real quick?
I'm curious, has staff mentioned any kind of timeline for when this could possibly go to council? I know this doesn't depend on commissioners, it depends on the council's own agenda. Just, I'm sure viewers would love to know when this issue could become.
I don't have a good answer for that. There's definitely a little bit more staff work to be done, and I know that the council has a busy agenda, so.
Is it something like early next year-ish, kind of?
I hope so.
Okay.
That's my hope, definitely.
Okay, so it's not going to open next week to non-residents?
No.
Or next month, so we'll stay tuned. Okay.
No, that's right.
All right. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being here and talking with us about access to Foothills Park.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's good to meet you both.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. Thank you for watching. If you think there are other people who are interested in this topic, you can go to the share button below, click on that, and get the URL to share on social media or on email. If you want to keep up with Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com. We'll see you next week.